Welcome to another podcast. We have with us Janek Ambros, who is a really talented director. He did the film May 15th in Paris. And it's a really cool film because it's kind of surrounding Napoleon and France and the revolution and all that stuff. It's a really fascinating point in time in history that I wish I knew more about. And after watching your film, I want to see something bigger, like an hour and a half type documentary. But my first question is for you is that, Janek, what made you want to make this film?
Well, the film tells a story of the French Revolution of 1848. So that's when Napoleon III, who I think was a nephew of Napoleon, as we know, when he took over the population and overthrew the Second Republic. But it's mostly used as like an allegory for what's happening now in the U.S. and Europe. So I used a lot of footage of Paris when I was there, right before the Macron-Le Pen election in 2016. And what made me want to kind of do this film was, at the time Trump was elected, about a year before, and Brexit was on everybody's mind. That was about, I think, about a year before the referendum. So it was like a very hot button issue. And we're still seeing this. And this rejection of globalism and the establishment across the West kind of coming in a lot of ugly forms, and mostly through, right-wing nationalism and all that. And I kind of want to see, well, how did these things happen? Not just in 1848, kind of using that as an example, but how are these right-wing nationalistic groups kind of popping up here and in the European Union zone? And basically this kind of question is, we using Trump as an example. We all know Trump is a problem, but he's a symptom of a problem as well. And you can say the same for Brexit or Le Pen or Duda in Poland or any of these other countries. So that's kind of what I wanted to get at.
I don't know that. Most people know that Napoleon would have been considered a dictator. So how does the film portray that a country unwittingly bringing a dictator into power when maybe they didn't know he was going to be one?
So there's still this question, how does this happen, right? And people kind of think it's not a binary thing. They think, well, is it racism and anti-immigration, or is it taking advantage of the poor population that kind of rightfully feels that the government has failed them? But it's both, right? Mussolini in the 1920s used the post-war crisis to his advantage, and obviously extremely xenophobic. In 1848 and here, it's not just that the government failed them. They outwardly, so before any kind of populist or pretend populist person comes about and turns out to be very authoritative, very nationalistic, very using anti-immigration policies to get people angry, to blame people, it usually does stem from this idea that before it happens, there usually is somebody in power, whether it be a monarch or an establishment kind of government. They outwardly embrace policies that hurt the poor. It disenfranchises people. And one of the inadvertent consequences of that, when you have a disenfranchised population, they're more susceptible for a dictator, or whatever it might not seem at the time, to come in and say, it's their fault. Your problems, your financial instability, your jobs being taken away, it's their fault, and I'll fix the problem. So that seems to be a common reoccurrence. And here in the US, 40% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. The top, 0.01% wealth has grown exponentially since the Great Recession. And these are all things that were brewing that really made it easier for someone like Trump to come in. And you can kind of use that example for not only just the US, but Europe across the board.
Can you think of some other examples of authoritarian and nationalist regimes rising to power in Europe and America?
Yeah. So, at the time when I was shooting this in Paris, you had Le Pen against Macron. And Macron is a great example of a more kind of neoliberal corporate establishment person or cohort that you're really seeing, luckily, but that's the funny thing, right, is Macron is definitely somebody who the populist wings of the country do not like. But Le Pen is not the answer. I mean, Le Pen, at the time, Le Pen was somebody who was running against him. So luckily, Le Pen lost. However, so France kind of has it somewhat under control, because I feel like there's a lot of populist movements in France that are trying to fight these kind of more corporate establishment policies, but through policies and solutions that are maybe more like, just for an American, sort of like, that are more like Bernie. So you're seeing a lot of the yellow vest uprisings, and they're more for populism. But they were very close to electing someone like Le Pen. So I would use that as example. There are some right-wing factions in France. But you're seeing in Poland, Andrzej Duda, who just actually got COVID. He recently won again. In Spain, you have the Vox Party, which is a nationalistic group. In Germany, the AfD is a right-wing nationalist group that's starting to gain some traction. Also, you have a lot of different places. In Hungary is another spot where there's kind of a rise in a huge rise in right-wing nationalism. And then, of course, England right now with Brexit. I mean, that was derived from very anti-immigrant policies, a very disenfranchised England, mostly in the north, obviously not in London. But that's having massive ramifications as we speak. They still haven't even figured out a deal between the EU, and that's a whole other disaster. So it's across the board. I mean, and it goes beyond just the U.S. and Europe. I just wanted to focus on that because we like to look at ourselves in Europe as these kind of beacons of democracy and all that crap, But the reality is we're dealing with a lot of big issues right now, and because we had so many failed policies, we're starting to see a lot of these racist right-wing groups that have no interest in helping the people or the poor people. They're faux populism, right? So those would be some other examples of nationalist regimes rising to power in the U.S. and abroad, more specifically to Europe.
One thing I've noticed you say again and again is that a similarity is shared between these different groups, and that they hate immigration, right? Or want to close off borders to that. Is there any other type of similar theme to all of these movements?
Yeah, I think that's just the go-to. It's a very unfortunate and horrific go-to, but because it's easy. That's the oldest trick in the book. You blame other people for the problems, right? But there are kind of the more underlying pinnings. There are some similarities. There's a rejection of so many things, right? There's a rejection of institutions as we know it. So in Europe, there's a total rejection of the EU, which is similar to the way that in America, there's a lot of rejection of the central government, the federal government, I should say. There's similarities in these groups with just racism, which is not dog whistling, but now just outwardly going out and being very, in America, whether it be against Black Lives Matter movement. In Europe, it's mostly against, Arab immigrants. There's a total rejection of globalism. There's a fear that, that we're all going, there's a lot of it's derived from conspiracy theories. So here in America, you have things like QAnon, which was funny a few years ago, but now, I think 25% of the American population believe in what QAnon believes. And, QAnon isn't something that's just domestic. QAnon is a global thing. This isn't an American movement. This is a global, radical, totally, whatever word you want to use for it, insane, crazy. But we have to kind of take it seriously. It was kind of this fringe, silly thing before, but now you have people being elected into Congress in November who are part of QAnon. And QAnon spreads throughout Europe and around the world, mostly because it's just gone totally unfettered, just by things like, by certain social media groups and all that stuff. And conspiracy theories, even, this isn't new. This is something that's been around since 1848. I mean, even when this film took place. And most of it, unfortunately, usually comes down to, if you whittle down the conspiracies, it always ends up going back to the same thing. Usually ends up going back to very anti-Semitic tropes. So I would say that these movements do have similarities across the board, and they usually deal with rejection of globalism, a fear of global, an irrational fear of maybe globalism, a rejection of institutions, racism, and conspiracy theories. And these are, and then of course, a leader of some kind that people can rally behind. And that usually comes in the form of a huckster politician.
I have a few questions about Napoleon, the main character in your film, because I've been to Paris one time, and I mean, he still seems like kind of a hero there in France. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that, but there's like still kind of like buildings that reference him and whatnot. How did the French feel about him? Because he did seem to bring like a lot of money and whether through war or whatnot to the and fame to the country. That's my perception.
Well, I think you might be thinking more of Napoleon Bonaparte, like the from earlier. Napoleon the Third, I don't think is as like, when people think France, they think of Napoleon. Napoleon the Third wasn't. He was in power for quite some time. He was the longest person in power since the monarch. But Napoleon the Third, I don't think he's some beacon of their history. I mean, basically what happened was he took over. So the Second Republic, which is what he took over, they took over King Louis Philippe. So it went from monarch, and they kind of try to do some provisional governance. The Second Republic, they once again kind of ignored the demands of the poor. But in terms of Napoleon III, I mean, I'm not really sure. I would have to be in France more to kind of really understand how they view that. I'm sure different pockets of the country view it differently. But I think right now France is more interested in trying to really look at what Macron's doing, and hopefully, like I talked about, they don't go the route of say what we did and elect someone like, just using this as a U.S. example, just because I know that maybe more of your audience is that. So many of these cases come down to this: you have a kind of corrupt establishment center, right, that does a lot of these policies. That would be someone maybe more like a Mitt Romney type, or even someone like a Hillary Clinton type or something like that, right? And in these countries, you have, say, in France, you have a Macron. That's similar to that. Now, you can go two routes to try to better that government. You can go the more Bernie Sanders Democratic Socialist route to kind of get rid of corruption, or you can go, which what a lot of these countries are doing, like us, you can go the Trump route, which is a way to kind of this faux populism, we're going to drain the swamp. And that's the path that we should not be going down. And I think France is a little bit going in more the direction of the Bernie direction, just like I said, to use that as an example. That they're very good at doing general strikes. They have a very good mechanism and way to kind of fight against Macron. So it gets very complicated in France, but right now I think for France that's their main focus right now, especially with the yellow vest movement and all that.
So as a filmmaker, I got to ask you, how did you get Barbara DeFina to be a part of this? Because she's been a producer on Casino and Goodfellas and a lot of Scorsese's work.
Yeah, so I was really fortunate. I was in the middle of editing the film, and I sent it to her. There was a few projects we were working on. She was helping me develop a few scripts. And yeah, I sent it to her, and she helped me, edit the film, which was really cool because probably my biggest inspiration out of any filmmaker, in the entire film industry is Thelma Schoonmaker, which is Martin Scorsese's editor. So a lot of the editing style I use is derived from what Thelma Schoonmaker does, and it was really cool. Actually, right before COVID, we played May 15th in Paris for Zanussi, who's a very respected Polish director in the 70s and 80s. So Scorsese and I were able to kind of present him a Lifetime Achievement Award over like a video, virtual, right around when COVID was hitting Spain. This took place in Spain. So that was very cool.
That's awesome. So tell us what else you have on tap and where people can find you.
Yeah, and then one really quick thing too. I just want to say, one actually interesting thing that's happening right now with coronavirus is actually is hurting these right wing movements, because what it's doing is it's saying that they're incapable of handling it. That you actually do need these institutions, and this is why it's so important to go out and vote, whether it's if you're in Europe or you're in the U.S. and you have on November 3rd, vote for Biden. He might not be the best candidate, but it's way easier to try to make change with Biden in power than it is with someone like Trump, who's way out there. So if people want to help out in battleground states, because it's nice to vote in New York and LA, but the battleground states are everything. You go to Vote Save America, and you can find ways to help. How you can maybe, with a week to go, how you can maybe help some of the states that really need the help to get Trump out. So I would just end on that. I mean, the stuff I'm working on, I'm sure me and you will talk again, and we can talk more about that. But for now, I think it's very important people to go out to vote. VoteSaveAmerica.com. You can help. There's ways to help battleground states, and they need it bad, because it's really important. I think that we vote Joe Biden in, and then work with the Biden administration to actually get some of these more populist agendas in.
Janek, thanks for coming on the show again. We love having you, and
yeah, man, absolutely.
And always appreciate getting to showcase what you're doing to our audience. So thanks again.
Absolutely, man. I'm excited for the next one.